16 years on live television. Ed Sullivan had never shed a tear, not when JFK was shot, not when legends collapsed on his stage, not through 10,000 hours of broadcasting to millions. Then came February 23, 1964. Mid-show, someone broke protocol and handed Ed a telephone. This was forbidden. No calls during broadcast, no exceptions. But the caller was 9-year-old Jimmy Castellano, dying in a Manhattan hospital, using his last strength to remind Ed Sullivan of yesterday's promise, to say his name on television before it was too late. Ed Sullivan did something that stunned 20 million viewers. He abandoned the script, told his audience about a dying boy who watched every Sunday, read Jimmy's handwritten letter on live TV. Then the impossible happened. Ed Sullivan, America's most emotionless host, began sobbing uncontrollably. For 47 seconds, tears poured down his face while an entire nation stood in their living rooms, applauding through their own tears for a child none of them had ever met. That night, the coldest man on television melted before America's eyes and taught us all what matters more than keeping composure. The Ed Sullivan Theater hummed with its familiar Sunday rhythm that February evening in 1964. 16 years of broadcasts had created a routine so precise that stagehands could set their watches by it. The CBS orchestra warmed up with the same scales they'd played since Eisenhower was president. Ushers guided families from Queens and tourists from Kansas to their seats. Everyone dressed in their church clothes, ready for America's weekly appointment with the biggest variety show on television. Ed Sullivan stood in the wings, reviewing his cue cards one final time. At 62, he'd become more institution than man. That distinctive hunched posture, the awkward gestures, the marble-faced expression that rarely cracked. All of it had become as familiar to Americans as their own living room furniture. 2 weeks earlier, he'd introduced the Beatles to 73 million viewers without so much as raising an eyebrow. Dean Martin liked to say that Ed could announce the end of the world and make it sound like he was introducing a ventriloquist act. The February 23rd lineup promised another solid evening of entertainment. The Supremes would perform their latest hit. Alan King had prepared 7 minutes of family-friendly comedy about suburban life. A SEAL trainer from Copenhagen would close the show with his trained animals balancing balls and playing tiny horns. Nothing controversial, nothing unexpected. Just the comfortable formula that had made Sunday nights sacred in 20 million American homes. Behind the curtain, Ed retreated to his dressing room for his pre-show ritual. Complete silence. No visitors, no phone calls, no exceptions. His producer, Bob Precht, knew better than to disturb these 15 minutes of solitude. It was the same routine Ed had followed since June 20th, 1948. The night the show premiered. In all those years, through illness and personal tragedy, through the death of his own brother, Ed had never deviated from this pattern. But tonight, something weighed on his mind. Yesterday, he'd driven to Sloan Kettering Cancer Center to visit a 9-year-old boy named Jimmy Castellano. The meeting had been arranged quietly. No press, no cameras, just Ed and a dying child who'd written him a letter in shaky handwriting. The boy's words were simple. He watched Ed's show every Sunday with his parents. It was the only hour of the week when his mother stopped crying. Could Mr. Sullivan maybe say hello to him on television before he went to heaven? Ed had sat on the edge of Jimmy's hospital bed, this titan of television making himself small beside a child who weighed 43 pounds. He'd promised Jimmy something special on tomorrow's show. The boy's face had transformed, the gray pallor momentarily forgotten in a smile that the nurses said was his first in 3 weeks. The 2-minute warning echoed through the theater. Ed emerged from his dressing room, shoulders squared, wearing the same dark suit he favored for every broadcast. The makeup artist made final adjustments under the harsh lights, while the floor director counted down on his fingers. In the control booth, Director Tim Kiley watched the monitors as cameras moved into position. Everything exactly as it should be. The red on AR light illuminated at 8 o'clock sharp. The orchestra struck up the familiar theme as Ed walked through the curtains to his mark. 20 million television sets glowed across America. Families settled into couches. Children sprawled on living room carpets. Grandparents adjusted their glasses. Sunday night with Ed Sullivan was as reliable as sunrise. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Ed began in his characteristically clipped tone. "Tonight, right here on our stage, we have a really big show for you." The audience applauded on cue. Ed introduced the Supremes, who glided on stage in matching silver gowns to perform "Where Did Our Love Go?" Diana Ross's voice soared through the theater while Florence Ballard and Mary Wilson provided perfect harmonies. The performance was flawless, professional, exactly what viewers expected. As the commercial break began 7 minutes into the broadcast, Ed walked toward his position for the next segment. That's when production assistant Sally Morrison appeared from nowhere, practically running across the studio floor. This never happened. In 16 years, no one had ever interrupted Ed during a broadcast. The cardinal rule was absolute. No calls, no messages, no exceptions until the show ended. Sally's face was white as paper. She carried a telephone with a long cord stretching back toward the production office. Her hands trembled as she approached Ed. Bob Precht nearly jumped from his chair in the control booth. The audience murmured, sensing something wrong in the break from routine. "Mr. Sullivan," Sally whispered urgently, "it's Sloan Kettering Hospital. They say it's about Jimmy Castellano. They say it can't wait." Ed's jaw tightened. He knew that name. The 9-year-old boy with leukemia. The child whose letter sat folded in his jacket pocket right now. The one he'd promised to acknowledge on tonight's show. But why were they calling? Visiting hours were over. The show was live. This call could only mean one thing. 30 seconds, Mr. Sullivan," the floor director called out, oblivious to the crisis unfolding. The audience settled back into their seats. The orchestra prepared for their return cue. 20 million Americans waited for their program to resume. The show must go on. It always had. That was the first law of live television. Nothing stopped the show. Nothing. Sally held out the phone, her whispered words cutting through the studio noise. "Jimmy took a turn. His mother says he might not make it through the night. He's asking for you." Ed stared at the receiver as if it were a foreign object. In the control booth, Tim Kiley watched his host frozen at center stage. The floor director frantically signaled, 5 seconds to air, 4, 3. The audience grew quiet, sensing the electricity of something unscripted happening before them. Ed took the phone. A child's voice, barely a whisper, traveled through the line. "Mr. Sullivan, are you really there?" The voice of a 9-year-old boy fighting to stay conscious, fighting to stay alive long enough to hear his hero say his name on television. Ed's hand gripped the receiver so tightly his knuckles went white. He handed it back to Sally without a word and walked to his mark as the cameras went live. But instead of reading from the cue cards, instead of introducing Alan King as scheduled, Ed did something that would become the most talked about moment in television history. He looked directly into the camera and spoke without a script. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to share something with you." His voice, usually sharp and rhythmic, had softened into something unrecognizable. Bob Precht dropped his clipboard in the control booth. This wasn't just breaking format. This was shattering 16 years of precedent. "Yesterday, I visited a brave young man named Jimmy Castellano at Sloan Kettering Hospital. 9 years old. He's fighting leukemia." Ed paused, his hand moving unconsciously to his jacket pocket. "Jimmy watches our show every Sunday with his parents, Maria and Tony. It's the 1 hour when his family can forget about hospital rooms and chemotherapy and what might come next." The theater had become a cathedral, not a cough, not a whisper from 500 people. Ed pulled out a folded piece of paper, Jimmy's letter, written in pencil on hospital stationery. His hands, steady through thousands of broadcasts, through meeting presidents and giants of entertainment, began trembling. "I want to read you what Jimmy wrote to me." Ed's voice caught slightly. He cleared his throat and continued. Dear Mr. Sullivan, I know you're very busy with famous people, but I wanted to tell you that your show makes me forget I'm sick. When you come on TV, my mom stops crying and my dad smiles. Could you maybe say my name on TV? I want my friends at school to know I'm still important, even though I can't come anymore. A woman in the third row pressed a handkerchief to her face. The camera operators, hardened New York professionals who'd seen everything, exchanged glances. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ed Sullivan didn't do this. Ed folded the letter slowly, his movements deliberate, as if holding something sacred. When he looked back at the camera, America saw something impossible, moisture gathering in the eyes of television's most stoic host. I just received word that that tonight might be... Ed stopped mid-sentence. For the first time in 16 years of live television, Ed Sullivan couldn't finish what he'd started to say. The words lodged in his throat like broken glass. He stood there, this monument of composure, visibly struggling. Then he did something that would shatter every expectation of who he was. He stepped closer to the camera, close enough that viewers could see his eyes clearly, and spoke directly to one small boy lying in a hospital bed 30 blocks away. Jimmy, I know you're watching. Your mom is holding the phone to your ear right now, isn't she? His voice had become tender, almost paternal. Jimmy, you are important. You're the most important person watching tonight. More important than any celebrity who's ever stood on this stage. More important than the Beatles. More important than Elvis. That's when it happened. The impossible thing that 20 million Americans would never forget. Tears began rolling down Ed Sullivan's face. Not the dignified single tear of a composed man, but real tears, streaming freely. Ed Sullivan, who hadn't cried at his father's funeral, who'd maintained granite composure through national tragedies, was sobbing on live television. I want everyone in this theater, everyone at home, to do something. Jimmy loves when the audience applauds. He told me yesterday it makes him feel like he's there with us, like he's not stuck in that hospital room. So Jimmy, Ed's voice broke completely. He had to stop, his shoulders shaking. This is for you, son. Ed began clapping, alone at first, his applause echoing through the silent theater. Then the orchestra conductor raised his baton, and 500 people rose as one. The applause built like thunder, rolling through the theater, spreading across America as millions joined from their living rooms. In the control booth, Tim Kiley whispered to his cameraman, "Keep rolling. Don't cut away. Let America see this." For 47 seconds, the applause continued. The cameras captured tears streaming down faces throughout the theater. Grown men who'd come for light entertainment found themselves weeping. Children pressed against television screens at home, clapping until their palms hurt. The CBS switchboard lit up like Times Square, thousands of calls flooding in simultaneously. Ed stood at center stage, making no attempt to hide his tears. His carefully maintained dignity, the professional armor he'd worn for decades, had dissolved completely. He wasn't Ed Sullivan the institution anymore. He was just a man crying for a dying child, and 20 million Americans were crying with him. When the applause finally died, Ed wiped his eyes with his handkerchief, not caring that 20 million people watched him fall apart. "I'm sorry, He paused, then shook his head. "No, I'm not sorry. Jimmy deserves our tears. He deserves everything." Alan King stood in the wings, scheduled to go on. Without prompting, he walked back to his dressing room. This wasn't a night for comedy. The Supremes, still in their silver gowns, stepped forward without being cued. Diana Ross took Ed's microphone gently from his trembling hand. "Jimmy, this is Diana. We're going to sing your favorite song again. Your mom told us yesterday, it's Where Did Our Love Go? This time, it's just for you." The Supremes performed not to the theater audience, but directly to the camera, as if serenading one small boy. Halfway through, Diana's voice caught. She continued through tears, her mascara running in dark streams. Every act that night abandoned their planned routines. Alan King eventually came out, not to tell jokes but to share gentle stories about his own childhood. The SEAL trainer from Copenhagen had his animals wave at the camera. "For Jimmy," he said in broken English. The entire show became a love letter to a dying child. During the final commercial break, Sally Morrison brought Ed another message. He read it, pressed it to his chest, and returned to the stage. "I've just received word from the hospital. Jimmy saw it all. He saw you applaud. He heard every word. His mother says he's smiling. He wanted me to tell everyone thank you and—" Ed's composure broke again, "and that he loves us back." The show ended not with Ed's traditional goodbye, but with him saying, "Good night, Jimmy. Sweet dreams, son." Within hours, Sloan Kettering received 50,000 telegrams addressed to Jimmy Castellano. Donations poured in, over $800,000 for pediatric leukemia research. The hospital had to hire temporary staff to handle the mail. Letters came from children who emptied their piggy banks, from grandmothers who sent their bingo winnings, from tough New York cab drivers who'd watched the show and couldn't stop thinking about that brave little boy. Jimmy Castellano died 6 days later, on February 29, 1964. Ed Sullivan served as a pallbearer, the only time he ever did so for someone not family. But perhaps Jimmy had become family in those 47 seconds when all of America stood together and applauded for a dying child. That night in February, Ed Sullivan taught America that our greatest moments don't come from perfect performances. They come when we're brave enough to let our hearts break in public, when we choose love over composure, when we remember that behind every strong facade is a human being capable of extraordinary tenderness.